So I came to focus my professional work on climate change in a way by accident. I was working on a book on the history of oceanography, and the book was really focused on the question of funding. Who was funding oceanography in the second half of the 20th century? The answer was the US Navy. And what difference did it make that nearly all of the funding for oceanography in this time period was coming from the Navy? So the book was really focused on the question of scientific patronage and how patronage affects both the questions that get asked, the questions that are considered important, and the kinds of answers that are developed for those questions. So that was the project that I was working on. In the process of doing that project, I stumbled across the work of a group of oceanographers who had been interested in the question of anthropogenic climate change going back to the 1950s and the International Geophysical Year. And those oceanographers were Roger Revelle, Hans Suess, and Dave Keeling at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where I was working at the time. And so there was this connection between where I lived and worked and this very, very interesting work that had been done back in the 1950s, in which this group of scientists predicted that man-made climate change would occur because of the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. And I thought that was pretty interesting, that the science was that old, that it went back that far, and that at that time, very, very few people knew about this work. This was, I'm talking now, I started doing this work in the early 2000s. So I became interested in it, and a few different things happened. One thing is that as I read the scientific literature, I started to get worried. As an earth scientist, I've always thought of myself as someone who cares about the planet, who loves the natural world. I hike, I ski, I snowshoe, I rock climb. You know, being out in nature is a big part of my life. But honestly, if you go back to, say, the 1990s, at that time, if you had asked me what I thought the biggest, crisis facing the natural world was at that time, I probably would have said biodiversity loss and habitat destruction. I was aware of climate change as an issue, but it wasn't really high on my radar screen, just as I think it wasn't really high on the radar screens of most people in the late 90s. But as I began reading the science, I came to understand how clear the science was, and that actually there was no disagreement in the scientific community about the fact that climate change was underway, that it was a serious threat, and that it was being driven primarily by greenhouse gases. But at that same time, in the mass media, climate change was being represented as a huge debate. And I remember very clearly one week when I was doing this work, President George W. Bush said in the mass media, made a speech in which he said, oh, it's a big debate, we don't really know. And he spoke very disparagingly of a report that had been written by the EPA on the issue. And so I became interested in the discrepancy between the conversation that was happening in the scientific community and the strength and robustness of the scientific evidence, the scientific data, in contrast to the conversation that was happening in the public sphere, which was that it was a big debate, we didn't know, it was very muddled, a lot of uncertainty. So there was this big disconnect between the scientific conversation and the public conversation. And so I wrote an article that was published in 2004 called The Scientific Consensus on Climate Change. It was a very short article, only one page long in Science magazine, in which I summarized what the scientific community was saying about climate change. And I did a little test in which I took a sample of papers published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and I said, what proportion of these papers disagree with that consensus? And the consensus statement I took from the US National Research Council, they had just written a big report on climate change, in which they used a line in which they said, most of the observed warming over the past 50 years is likely to have been due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. So I asked the question, okay, well, that's the scientific leadership, but that might not necessarily be representative of rank-and-file scientists. So we can tell what rank-and-file scientists think by what they've published in the literature. So I took a sample of literature, I asked the question, how many of these papers disagree with that statement from the leadership? And the answer was none, not a single paper in the sample. So I thought that was a pretty significant result. I submitted to Science magazine, they published it, and then all hell broke loose. I started getting hate mail, threatening phone calls, hate email. I was attacked on the floor of the US Senate by Senator James Inhofe, who at the time I had no idea who he was. I got a very strange phone call. I picked up my phone, and a guy at the other end of the call says that he's calling me from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he writes for, I wish I could remember now, but one of the newspapers in Tulsa. And he said, "Are you aware of the fact that our senator is attacking you by name?" And I said, "No, I'm not aware of that, and can you explain to me why?" So it was a very strange thing to have written this paper, very objective, very fact-based paper based on a factual, analytic, quantitative analysis of peer-reviewed scientific literature. So not subjective, not an opinion piece, but just the facts. Nor did I say anything about what we should do about climate change. I didn't make any policy recommendations. I just said, look, this is what scientists are saying. And for that, I became a target of attack. And so then what happened was I started becoming interested in, well, who are these people that are attacking me and why? So there was a long journey from there to here, but the short version of that is that as I began to learn who the people were who were attacking me, I discovered this incredible story that they were the same people who had attacked the scientists who had predicted and discovered the ozone hole, the same people who had attacked the scientists who had discovered and analyzed acid rain, the same people who had attacked the scientists who had documented the harms of tobacco use. And in some of these, not all of these scientists, but several of them, you could actually trace this story back to original work in the tobacco industry in the 1970s and 80s. And when I discovered that this was a story about a kind of organized, systematic attempt to discredit science in a whole bunch of different areas related to the environment and public health, then I realized there was a story to be told. So I actually set aside my work on the history of oceanography in order to write what became the book Merchants of Doubt. And now here I am, 14 years later, finally finishing my oceanography book. Yeah.